Delegated legislation without judicial control. Delegated legislation without judicial control refers to a form of delegated legislation in which the enabling act empowers the executive to make rules, regulations, or orders and attempts to provide that the validity of such delegated legislation shall not be questioned before any court of law. The distinctive features of this type of delegation is the attempted exclusion of judicial control over rules and regulations made by the executive under delegated powers. Nature of delegated legislation without judicial control. Under this type of delegation, the legislature attempts to prevent courts from examining the validity or legality of rules and regulations made by the executive. The objective is to give the executive greater freedom in exercising its delegated legislative powers without the possibility of judicial interference. Executive discretion. The executive receives authority to formulate detailed rules and regulations under the Parent Act. If the legislation attempts to exclude judicial control, the executive may appear to have considerable freedom in exercising these delegated powers. However, such provisions raise important constitutional questions because the rule of law requires governmental authorities to act within the limits of their lawful powers. Importance of judicial control. Judicial control over delegated legislation is important because courts can examine whether an administrative authority has acted within the powers delegated to it. Without such supervision, there is a greater possibility of arbitrary or excessive exercise of delegated power. Protection of individual rights. Judicial review provides an important safeguard for citizens against unlawful administrative action. It enables courts to examine whether delegated legislation violates legal or constitutional limitations. Therefore, complete exclusion of judicial control may conflict with the principles of rules of law and protection of individual rights. Constitutional significance. The executive receives delegated legislative power from the legislature and must exercise it within the limits of the Enabling Act. A subordinate authority cannot acquire unlimited legislative power merely because the parent act attempts to exclude judicial scrutiny. Judicial review. In constitutional systems such as India, judicial review is an important mechanism for controlling delegated legislation. Courts may examine whether subordinate legislation exceeds the authority granted by the Parent Act or violates constitutional provisions. Thus, an attempt to completely exclude judicial control over delegated legislation raises serious constitutional concerns. Conclusion. Delegated legislation without judicial control is a form of delegation in which the Enabling Act attempts to exclude judicial scrutiny of rules and regulations made by the executive. Although such provisions may seek to provide greater administrative flexibility, judicial control is essential for preventing excessive delegation, abuse of power, arbitrariness, and violation of legal or constitutional limits. Therefore, the principle of judicial review remains an important safeguard in controlling delegated legislative power.